Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited for today's topic, and we're excited that you guys are able to join us. So today we're going to be talking about how to leverage your scientific value from PhD to MSL. And I know this is a topic of interest for a lot of the listeners today. So we're really excited to have our guest speakers today, and Tom and I are here to help facilitate the dialogue. But we just want to say thank you so much to our guest speakers for joining us today, and thank you everyone for listening in. We really, really appreciate you guys just joining us for these talks. Tom, is there anything you want to chime in on?
Yeah, I am excited for this conversation, and I'm excited for these two guests. So I know both of these lovely ladies very well. We are very, very fortunate to have them with us. So this is going to be a great chat. So thank you guys all for joining us, and let's do intros. So Kristin, why don't we start with you?
Awesome. And thank you again for having me. It's always exciting to be on these shows. You know, Tom, I always listen to your podcast and find it so incredibly useful and informative. So thank you for all you do for this career space. So my name is Kristin Speaker. I'm currently a field medical director with Dermavant Sciences, which is a fancy title for medical science liaison, right? It tends to confuse people, but there's different titles for this job depending on the company that you're at. I've been with Dermavant now for just about a year as an MSL, but prior to that, I was with AbbVie for 5 years, where I started my career as an MSL straight out of my postdoc. So my PhD is in psychoneuroimmunology. It's really an integrative physiology type degree where I studied the impact of psychological stress on systemic cytokine expression and cytokine expression in body fat tissue. So I had a lot of exercise physiology background. There's some short-term fasting in there, all sorts of, again, a very integrative approach to, that scientific degree in immunology. So all in all, I've been in MSL now for about 6 years, all in the dermatology therapeutic area, which we'll be talking a little bit about as we, move through this discussion today.
It's impressive because I can't spell cytokine. So, as always, I am the least educated person in this room. So don't mind me. I'm just the host. Actually, Julie's the host. I'm just the co-host.
Tom is our main figurehead, but he's our celebrity among medical affairs. So we're always graced by his presence. We'd love to hear an introduction from you as well, Alana.
Oh. Yes. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Tom and Julie, for having me here. I think we're going to have a really great discussion. I'm excited to be here with Kristin. But yes, my name is Elena Manson. I tell people it's Alana like banana. And my PhD is in cognitive neuroscience. So maybe not entirely too different from you, Kristin. I studied cognitive impairment associated with neurodegenerative diseases, so mostly Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. And I've been in MSL for just over 2 years. I pretty much went into the MSL role straight from my PhD. And so I started out in the neurology space as an MSL with Synovian Pharmaceuticals. And then currently I'm an MSL with Sobi in the rare disease space.
Amazing. And I mean, so I'm sure a lot of our listeners are PhDs, but for those who are not, or those who just want to get, let's get everyone onto some sort of baseline. Getting a PhD is a very long road. And it doesn't just involve a lot of fancy scientific words, but it does involve a lot of that. But what kind of backgrounds and schooling do most PhDs have? Can you share a little bit about like what your experience is like as a PhD, what you have to go through during your schooling and to get your final degree? Kristin, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So I have a little bit of a unique story in the fact that, I did my bachelor's degree in kinesiology, ex-phys, and then I took 10 years off before going to grad school. I always tend to do things a little backwards and the hard way, right? So when I went back, I had to do my master's first. I couldn't go straight into the PhD. So I spent 2 years doing my master's, and during that process, during some of my scientific classes, I just fell in love with immunology, and my professor was just amazing. And she's like, "You got to come to my lab." So at that point, I transferred labs, went into the immunology lab, where it took me another 4 years to actually do the PhD itself. Yeah, so 6 years total. Started with the bachelor's, master's, then PhD.
So actually my background is pretty similar, and I think that that's unique for the two of us. There's, a few different routes you can take to get the PhD. So I think more commonly people go straight from undergrad through to the PhD. But some people like us get a terminal master's degree. I got that basically right after my undergrad, and then I took time off to work as a clinical research coordinator, which that experience has really served me well in the MSL role because I have a great understanding of the clinical research process, having managed basically 25 pharmaceutically sponsored trials, mostly phase 2 and phase 3. And then after a few years working, I decided I always knew I wanted to go back to get the PhD, but I'm glad that I had that time to be in the workforce, and then went on to get my PhD. But regardless of the route that you take to get to the PhD, everyone's going to be heavily immersed in scientific research. And the way that that looks is really different based on your program and also your mentor. So, for example, I was involved in grant funded research and investigator initiated grant funded research. And that's slightly different than the pharmaceutically sponsored investigator initiated studies that we in medical affairs help support. But nonetheless, I think that the skills are definitely transferable. You help write protocols, you help with the conduct of the study, sometimes analysis, and then writing up and publishing papers. So I think all of that is just really valuable stepping into the MSL role.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like that's a good chunk of MSLing and not even the beginning roles of MSLs. It's as you get more advanced into your career, those things really, really come into play. So given obviously your scientific and research expertise, how do you feel like, maybe new people who are interested in transitioning, or how would you now, knowing that you have some experience, like how would you highlight your more unique strengths and transferable experiences that a PhD that specifically can bring to the medical affairs team?
So I'll take a stab at this a little bit. It really depends on the company that you're joining and the therapeutic area that you're trying to go into. You're going to take a good look at that job description. You're going to work very closely, hopefully, with a recruiter like Tom, who's going to be able to support you in framing and designing your CD resume in a way that's going to be appealing to what the company is in need of. All of the MSL roles across the companies look very, very different. The way they use the MSLs, some are very clinically driven and they use, the MSLs a lot for the clinical research component. Those companies tend to have a rich and deep pipeline, right? Versus other companies don't. The company I'm currently working with doesn't. We're a one drug company right now. So there's not a lot of pipeline and not a lot of clinical research that's going on that would allow for transferable skills for a PhD to appeal, right, to the hiring manager in this case, especially if you're new to the MSL role. But, as Elena had said, there's so many things that you do in your PhD that if you frame it properly, it can be very, very appealing and very useful for med affairs teams, not only to get in the door as an MSL, but also, as you said, Julie, for the potential in all of the places and ways you can grow yourself within med affairs and kind of either stay in the MSL role or maybe move into something in clin development, right? As you mature and kind of figure out your career path in the pharma industry.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. And it really is so important to look at the different job descriptions because you might be a really good fit for one type of company and a really bad fit for another. So just be very cognizant of that. But I think that there is something I could highlight that is going to be good for any MSL coming into the space to highlight. So, of course, we have a ton of transferable skills that can be valuable in the role, but one standout quality of successful MSLs that I see is those who are able to ask calibrated questions and those who have a genuine sense of curiosity. And I think that PhDs possess both of these qualities, whether it's more innate and developed or if it's actually a learned skill throughout the doctoral education. But as scientists, we are taught to question the science in an agnostic way. So maybe it's questioning a scientific method or something else. But I think that this translates to engagement with KOLs, really coming in, being curious about what their take on your data is, or how this compares to what they're seeing in the clinic. And so really asking those calibrated questions coupled with that genuine sense of curiosity not only is going to help you get the information and kind of the why behind a KOL statement, but I think naturally it's going to help you build that rapport.
I think everything you guys said is truly on point. It does, going back to what Kristin said a little bit, it does depend a little bit on your company, right, and where they're at. But I think for me, coming from a PharmD, what I have valued so much from my PhD partners is their ability to navigate the scientific data just so easily. They know it back and forth. They can kind of understand the parameters and nuances. They are able to really take that objective step back and really see the data as it's supposed to be, and realize what the power of the data is or where the power lacks. And I think that's really, really important. It's something I think PhDs just do because they have been trained in it for so long, and they probably don't even realize that they're able to weave through that data and scientific knowledge so easily. But I think that's one of the strengths. And I always rely on my PhDs to be like, so what are your thoughts on this? What does that mean to you for this p-value? What does this hierarchy mean to you? So I think having that perspective is really, really valuable. I'd love to hear, Tom, from your perspective, from a recruiter, like what are some things that you see on when you're screening and you see PhDs come across your lab? What are things that pop out to you that I think are really unique and useful for putting them into MSL roles?
Well, one of the things I talk about all the time, and anyone that's been either coached by me or has kind of come through our world, is I think it's really important to highlight your scientific value proposition. So especially if you're a PhD that has a focus, so for example, on neuroscience, well, what areas of neuroscience are you an expert in? And what kind of, experience and scientific acumen value do you bring to that organization? So if you're applying for a position, let's just say, and the company's focus is on, I don't know, let's say it's epilepsy, and you have a lot of experience with movement disorders. Well, obviously you want to highlight that. You want to show them that you can go toe to toe with thought leaders because you have that experience, and you can be a great advocate for the organization in your ability to communicate whatever scientific data they need to share. So I always try to break things down to scientific expertise as much as possible and whenever you can. So this is, I think, really especially important for PhDs, is to really showcase your, your experience and your scientific background.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there's something to be said. Being able to speak the scientific jargon, like naturally, and know, everything from the diagnosis, from like lab markers, it really, really, sometimes that's not even the focus of your company or molecule. But when you can do that shop talk with top TLs, they really respect you when you're able to bring that language and be able to understand what they're referring to. And so I think that's also absolutely a huge strength, is going back to that scientific value. I'd love to maybe touch a little bit upon, like, what do you think some of the challenges that PhDs face when trying to apply? And then maybe even in their first few months or year, like what are the things that you think that they would have to overcome?
I'll start this one off. So I think naturally understanding what is clinically relevant might be a little bit more difficult for a PhD if they haven't interacted much with patient-facing healthcare providers. Again, I just think that's kind of obvious. And Julie, as you mentioned, as scientists, we do love to dive into the science of things, the nitty gritty, go into those deep conversations. And sometimes you will have a KOL who loves that, and you can go into that. But generally, more times than not, I think you need to pull out what's most clinically relevant, be mindful of time, because HCPs, we all know, are overburdened. So I think that's one point. Another thing that I know that was difficult for me is I didn't know anything about payers. And so as a pharmacist, Julie, I mean, you definitely know that. So I heavily lean on my colleagues who have more of that clinical background, When I started, I asked a ton of questions. I still ask a lot of questions, and I will continue to learn in that space. And then one thing that's just kind of a mindset block is that you might think you have to have experience to step into the MSL role, but really it's about how you talk about those transferable skills. So getting away a little bit from more of the academic talk and talking about outcomes and how what you did resulted in X. And I think that when you talk with people who have a PhD who are in the MSL role, it's really important to listen to how they talk about those transferable skills, because you certainly have them.
Definitely agreed. What about you, Kristin? What do you think some of the challenges are in applying or when you're a new MSL as a PhD?
Yeah. I will say, when you first step into this role, if you're coming straight out of your PhD, it's quite overwhelming, right? So when I started, it was
It's overwhelming for everybody.
I was new to pharma, right? I was new to the role. I'd not even heard of psoriasis, much less Humira, which was the biologic drug I was representing. And I would call it adalimumab, not adalimumab, right? You know, these funny little things. But when you step in, you're getting thrown into pharma, you're getting thrown into the role, you're getting thrown into the therapeutic area, you're getting thrown into the drug mechanism, right? And then also the therapeutic landscape that you're responsible for really getting a good feel for in order to really be good in the field and have value when it comes time to answer those questions. So I think first and foremost, just know it takes a good couple of years. It really does. You're going to be working your fanny off, and it feels like you're just spinning in circles a little bit to try to get your feet underneath you and try to figure out how things work and you know, the politics. And, you know, Alana, you said just the key term was clinical relevance, right? There's one thing that you lose coming into the MSL role, at least from my perspective in dermatology, is it's not mechanistically heavy. So as a PhD, you're constantly asking why. I mean, your job as a PhD is to explore mechanism. And a lot of times that's just not valued to the same degree in the med affairs space, right? But also it really depends on the therapeutic area you're going into. It also depends on your territory and the types of KOLs you're going to be speaking with. But learning how to speak their language and to take the science and to take, you know, whether it be the efficacy or the safety information and frame that in a way that's clinically relevant is truly the art of the job. And that's not something you're used to doing as a PhD. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's so interesting because I think MSL teams obviously are made up of a variety of people and background experiences, but it's so important to have all of those so that everyone can learn from each other. That's kind of how you build your super team, right? You have your people who have clinical practice experience, maybe people who have more payer managed care experience, and then your people who are very experienced in clinical trials and research and having that strong scientific background. Because we all have different strengths in the whole MSL role, right? We have to encompass all of these traits. And a lot of us come in with strengths in one area. And we have to learn the other side of it. And other people come in with their side. So it's just, it is really, I mean, I think that super team really has to be made up of multiple backgrounds because then that's how you learn from each other. So I think, you know, it's very, very valuable that to highlight what you have and not be as concerned about what you don't have, and then just learn from your partners, right? So I think, you know, exactly what you said, you know, like asking questions. I learn a lot from my partners all the time. And I think the more you hear, the better your information becomes, the better you can express it. I always say 2 brains are better than 1 and 5 are probably better than 2. And so, you know, I think that collective thought, right, is everyone's looking at it from their lens, they share, and then you come up with a better perspective from it and a better way to discuss your data. I think it does depend on the molecule though, because sometimes there can be heavy discussion on mechanism. And that's where, like sometimes, like when I first started with semi-role, I struggled a little bit in explaining the nuances because I didn't understand, like, how does the gene transcription happen exactly in this molecule? And, you know, having to go, you know, for me, it was like undergrad, I did biochemistry. Having to go back to that and put that hat back on and trying to understand it was definitely a challenge as well. So I think there is all sorts of challenges that everyone has to deal with when they first start, but it's different depending which angle you come from. So, we're all MSLs right now, and I'd be curious because there's always different rules for people out there. What would you like to see, new roles for PhDs for? Because I think you do have a strong scientific background. You really do understand the ins and outs of clinical trials. What do you think future roles are for PhD? Where would you like to see positions for PhDs in companies?
I think first up, I'd like to see more people making it higher up. It's also very unique based on the company, what they prefer in terms of background degrees when they start to look at vice president level, positions, leaders of global med affairs. Do they really favor? My experience has been they tend to favor MDs.
Right.
But I think, just PhDs have so much to offer. You just have to be strategic about it.
Right.
You have to be very strategic about the questions you ask and how you go about interacting with all of your cross-collaborative partners. But to see more PhDs in the higher up positions, I would really like to see more of that. But I think to do that, you need a higher proportion of the MSL teams being PhDs. Right now, we're 20 deep in my team. I'm one. We only have one PhD. It's just me. So again, it really depends. It really depends on the company, the therapeutic area, the drug, all of those types of things. But get more of them to the top, please.
And I feel like it's an easier transition to become part of clinical development or on the R&D side. And same with even being like a scientific director, right? Or a similar type of role where they're on the scientific side or leading approval for clinical trials or research, right? But it's interesting because I don't think, maybe some people do who get their MBAs, but the majority of us don't come in having a lot of business and strategy background, right? So we have to learn as we go. So I think that is something that a lot of us have to learn on the job as we go to understand the scientific background and how that applies to strategy. So it's really interesting because I think that's something that has to be picked up along the way, unless people came in with that MBA and are able to flex that skill very quickly. But I do see a lot of PhDs able to jump over to clinical development more than I would say providers do, right? So if you have an NP or PharmD or a PA, I think we struggle more in trying to make that jump. Like if you're trying to not change your career, but you're looking at different career options, there's less chance for you to make it to the clin dev because you just don't have that clinical research background experience, right? So I think it is interesting that, again, we get pulled back into what our expertise is, but we really do want to see people expand, right? I think, and I'm with you, I think a lot of companies favor MDs, and that makes sense as well. I just think there's strength in having different type of backgrounds and upper leadership. So I completely agree with you. What are your thoughts, Alana?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with the two of you. Very great points. I'm going to throw something out there that piggybacks off of what you're saying, but it might be a little bit different. So obviously within medical affairs, there's many opportunities. I think we see medical excellence now. That's been a job that we saw a need for within medical affairs. And I think it is a great role. But outside of that, I think that there's real opportunity for PhDs in marketing and brand strategy. So going back to that strategy, I think that this is occurring a little bit. I would like to see it happen some more. And of course, at the leadership level, there is that crosstalk between, all cross-functional departments, medical and marketing. But I think having someone with that deep scientific knowledge sitting day to day, working on generating marketing materials and education, launch prep readiness, maybe leading a thought leader liaison team. I think that this would really bring a unique perspective, and it could be a little bit of like a niche area for PhDs. I think that marketing is kind of a curious area. And so if you can bring creative people together that connect dots in different ways, maybe you could have a launch strategy that's really unique and stands out. The questions that someone with a deep scientific background is going to ask are going to be different, but possibly complementary to someone with a marketing background is going to ask. So really, Julie and Kristin, what you've said, bringing those diverse backgrounds together, I think can be really synergistic and you could have a really robust marketing strategy.
I think you hit on something that's really might be a secret sauce. You see certain companies starting to do that, right? They're starting to bring in not your normal people into marketing, right? And they bring in people with more scientific or healthcare backgrounds. And you see their that department, that TA, that brand really just get into the market and take over. And it's like you'll ask them like, oh, well, who's leading? And they're like, oh yeah, we have, X, Y, and Z. And you're like, that's so fascinating. So I think it really shows because they are able to come with a stronger scientific sense. They have a different lens to bring in. So yeah, absolutely. I think that might be very wise for a lot of companies to integrate in the future. I know typically they would pick someone who has more of an MBA background. Some of them have no scientific background at all or did it as, a BS, right? And which is absolutely fine as well too. I think those are all great. But again, I think having that mix, being able to pull from everyone's experiences makes the company stronger, honestly. So I would love to hear if there's any last advice or tips for people aspiring or coming in. We'd love to hear questions from the audience. So I think we have a couple coming in, but if you guys have any advice or any like last tidbits you want to share with the audience before we went to questions, we'd love to hear it from you.
I'll pitch in here. I see Sarah's question, really asking for tips for breaking into the field. And I think this kind of helps summarize what we've been talking about as a whole throughout the conversation is taking your PhD background and really looking at the scientific knowledge that you've built and trying to find, your first company where that knowledge is really going to complement the drug and the scientific or the disease state that you're going to be working in and on. My background in immunology, I sold the heck out of that when it came time to get hired, right? My understanding of cytokines, and here Humira was an anti-TNF, which is one of the most potent pro-inflammatory cytokines. Taking that knowledge, take your PhD and figure out how to frame it in your scientific knowledge in a way that's going to benefit the team and the company, and try to move for your first time in, get into a therapeutic area that's most in alignment with your education. I think that's going to give you the best foot in, and it's also going to make that transition a little bit more smooth and not so overwhelming.
Yeah, completely agree. And maybe I'll just kind of add a how-to for that, because I know for me, I need to know, okay, how do I execute on something like that? So I know that this has been said likely ad nauseum, Tom, on your podcast and on these lives, but networking is so important. So, but don't just network, it needs to be strategic. And so in that, I alluded to this before. Ask those questions of the PhDs who are MSLs. How did you leverage your skills? How did you make it apparent that you have these transferable skills for whatever therapeutic area you're trying to go into? I think that it takes a lot of work to move away from the academic, how academics talk about things and experiences, to more industry focused. And so that needs to happen not only verbally when you're prepping for interviews, but in your resume, which the resume is what gets you in the door. So being able to ask those questions and apply that to the experiences you've had, I think will be incredibly valuable.
I agree. I mean, I think this is probably really good advice for everybody, right? Just in general, PhD, PharmD, NP, PA, whatever your background is, MD, I think finding when you're first breaking in, finding that space that you're most comfortable with scientifically, clinically, but also one that you're passionate about, right? Because that's the one you're going to be interested and curious about learning more about and investing yourself into, right? And so I think that's always, you have to either come with the scientific expertise or the MSL experience. And for those who are always breaking in, you have to try to lean on your scientific experience, right? And your clinical experience in that area. So that's what you want to be able to highlight. But I think that's like, it's one of the things that we all struggle with coming in, is like making that jump over the jargon, the talk, understanding what industry really is. And I say this probably too many times at the end of these talks, but really go listen to Tom's podcast. I think it has helped so many of us get jobs, the job that we wanted, right? And I think listening to that, hearing the discussion, do all of your homework first before you start opening the dialogue with people on LinkedIn. Because if you're going to get 10, 15, 20 minutes live with someone, you don't want it to be basic questions that you could have gotten from the podcast, right? You want it to be really specific questions to that person where you really learn from them, right? So I think trying to do as much homework as you can before you come in to know what the discussion's about, how do they talk in pharma, what's important. But again, listen to his podcast. He has a whole directory for everything now because I think he has, I wait 135 episodes, 150 episodes.
I just recorded 151 today. So, but one of the things I wanted to add though, to what you said, Alana, is it's really important to keep in mind that there is, and I don't want to offend anybody by saying this, but there is a bit of a stigma for PhDs that, they're, lab rats, and may have scientific experience and the scientific background. No, but I'm serious. I think that one of the things that's really important, and I want to call this out because I think you guys really need to make sure that you showcase your communication skills and your ability to engage and connect in the interview process right from the word go. You don't want to come off as somebody who's used to being in a lab and analyzing data and science. You want to be able to show that you have the skills to be successful as an engaging MSL. And what does that look like? It's not just your ability to communicate and speak well, but you also have to ask the right questions. Alana mentioned calibrated questions and how important it is to come prepared and ask the right questions that a reporter would ask. How questions, what questions. You want to make sure that you're opening up the other person and showing them that you could be effective in a conversation. That's paramount. That's really important, because if you can't do that on the interview, you're certainly not going to be able to do that in a KOL meeting. So make sure that you're prepared to showcase your communication skills.
One thing I've had, PhDs ask me is because they're like, I don't have projects or experience speaking, right? I don't have opportunities for speaking engagements. And for me, what I've shared with them is I think you need to create those experiences. You volunteer to be a mentor for people coming in, hold quarterly discussions and lead those group discussions on whatever it is for your lab, for your department. Lead journal clubs. You can create it. If it's not there, create it. Find articles, you lead, you discuss, have someone else lead after you've gotten it going. And you can say, I started this, I lead it, I run this monthly discussion, this quarterly discussion, I help mentor, and I'm very comfortable leading these kind of discussions. And I think that there's so many things you can do from that. If you're very passionate about a certain clinical area, find out where the patient advocacy groups are. Join your local scientific groups and medical groups. They are not, not going to let you join because you're a PhD. You're there to help participate, be a volunteer in the community, and you will hear more discussions. So I think there's like a lot of opportunity. And if there's not, then you find and create your opportunity for you to get the experience that you want, right? You can't wait for your job. I always say this, you can't wait for your job to give you and make the opportunity for you, right? If you want it, go out and find it somehow. So I feel like we have a couple very similar questions still, though, mostly looking for insights on how to break in. I think we had a quick question on certification, if getting an MSL certification is valuable. What are your guys' thoughts on that?
So one thing that's been running through my head as I've been listening to everyone speak, and I've actually been on the interview and hiring panel for some of the MSLs for our role, and it's been fascinating to see things from that perspective. And for those of you that are out there that are really looking to break into this role, the first thing you're going to need to address, and to address it with confidence, is why they should hire you without having any MSL experience, right? And really being able to just bring it up and tackle it. And if you can demonstrate that you've done your homework in understanding the role by connecting with different MSLs, and as you all have said, speaking the language of the job, despite not having had this job, and demonstrating that is going to be imperative to helping get over that initial hurdle of not having the MSL experience. So do your homework on the role as best you can. From Tom's podcast, I had read books. I mean, I really demonstrated that I understood what I was signing up for by applying for an MSL job. And that really made a difference in actually getting hired. So I think that helps kind of address some of these questions a little bit. But Alana, what are your thoughts on this? How did you get your job?
Yeah, so with regard to the certification, do I think it's necessary? No. Can it be helpful? Possibly. It depends on your personality. For myself, I started networking and educating myself on the role 18 months before I defended my dissertation. Granted, I wanted to give myself the room to go slowly because I was working on my dissertation. But it's typically not a quick process because there is a lot to learn about the role and to think about how can I leverage my experiences and talk about this in the right way. So with these professional societies and groups, I think that can help you out. Like you don't have to go digging as much. Although I listen to the MSL Talk podcast, Tom. I searched a ton on the internet, but for example, something that I found beneficial was within the professional group that I joined. They encourage you to video yourself practicing interview questions. And that was huge for me because it's uncomfortable for everyone at the beginning. You have to do that because if you get to that interview process and you haven't practiced, you're likely going to stumble a little bit. And so I found that helpful, but do I think a certification is necessary? No, but it's not going to hurt you by any means.
I mean, I think certification, again, is helpful for maybe for those who need a little bit of help being walked through it. Maybe their learning style is different. They prefer to have a set format to follow. I think, I didn't get a certification beforehand. I do think there's value in it. And especially for those who maybe are shorter on time and wanting to make the transition quicker. But I do think you can do it without a certification as well. I think you have to have the gumption and the want to comb through everything for yourself and figure out what it is. But I think that's also part of the process, right? To show that you're taking initiative, this is something you truly want. And it is really common for people to stumble along the way. We all did. No one gets there maybe some people do, but it's very rare you get your first job for your interview. Most of us are applying, and you feel like your application went into a black hole and you never hear back from you don't even get the rejection letter until like 6 months later. And you're like, oh, good. I'm glad you got my application. So I think that's a really common process for a lot of us. And I think in a weird way, it weeds out those who truly want the job and who don't.
And as far as the certification piece, I tried to put a note in the dialogue box. For whatever reason, it's read only on my side. So if you want to hear my thoughts on the whole certification thing, episode 85 of the MSL Talk podcast, I explain exactly my feelings, actually dissect things a little bit. It's not a super long episode, so check it out. I agree with Alana. I don't think it's a mandatory. I do think you will learn. I think it could be helpful, but just by doing those certifications is not going to guarantee you anything. So listen to the podcast. I think it's worth 20 minutes.
Thank you so much, everyone. If you guys have any last minute questions, please go ahead and pop them in. I feel like we were able to tackle most of them. Let me know if I missed any, but I feel like most were asking for examples of how to transition in or opportunities or how to create more transferable skills. So if I missed anything, let me know. Yes, and then just, again, people echoing your recommendation, Alana, on recording yourself. It's very true. I think one of the things is, we're required to speak a lot and present a lot, and you can do it, but do you know what you're saying and how you come across when you're doing it? You could have done it a million times. Watching yourself is very different. It's always different. But yeah, thank you so much for everyone who joined us today. We'd love to hear any, last minute questions or comments you guys have for you. Go ahead and throw them in. But thank you so much for joining us live today. And we're so grateful for our two wonderful guest speakers today. You guys are amazing to have on. We love having you guys on today.
You guys are awesome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm going to give you a quick closeout here.
Go for it.
One of the best things you can do, especially with all of the interviews that are virtual these days, is stand up tall, smile, and just be happy. Be likable on screen, be personable. You know, in the first 5 minutes of the interview, they're gonna know whether or not they want to move you forward or not. And just having a smile and really being yourself, I think, is one of the most important things to getting the right job for you. And just believe that you can, because you all can. Do your homework, feel confident, do your homework on the company, know what you bring to the table, and just smile and have fun with it. Yeah, you guys will get the jobs. You will.
That is amazing advice. I hope everyone is encouraged to do their homework and take a look at some of the resources we have. But thank you so much for joining us, everyone, today.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for joining us. Thank you to our speakers and our guests. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Elena. Thank you, Kristin. And this was a great turnout. Today we had a lot of people, so I appreciate you guys all for joining us. And thank you all for your really kind words about the podcast. We're 150 episodes, 3 years in, and almost 300,000 listeners in 88 countries. So, and I owe it all to you guys.
Yay. Well, thanks for having us. Thanks for joining, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye, guys. Thanks so much.